Okay, I'll start putting this stuff together. I'll just put the finest white of molybdenum paste on that pin that the pallet wheel's going to run on. Don't want any drag on that. This little arm, I'll just put white through the centre. Some on the tip there where that catches, that'll probably do. That sits over that post. And that's in the set position there, so if I hold back this arm and pull this forward, just enough that I can get this spring in easily. The spring runs from that hole to this post here. So take a pair of pliers so I can grasp the spring. Normally I'll put something in between here so that that's not being pulled away too far. The spring hooks over here and stretch it out. I can't see what I'm doing there, I have to turn this around. Let's try it from that direction. The problem when you're doing things for the camera instead of doing things for yourself, everything is upside down and hard to see. So this is now spring loaded, and as soon as the shutter, the blade actuating ring starts to move, this releases. Alright, that part went smoothly enough. This lever goes in place. It's spring loaded. Just put a white through the centre there. Find a more robust pair of pliers, tweezers. That goes on this post here, and it has to sort of clip under this flash contact. So I just push the spring in against the case like that, hook it over the post, and I'm pulling it this way. You couldn't see any of that because it was under my finger. That's alright, I couldn't see it either. But there it is, it's seated in position. That's also a problem. Well, it would be much easier if you had transparent fingers. I'll put that flash contact in place and set this action. That sits down over a little collar on the top of that post. It'll do it for me. Let's release that. That'll do. You can see the relationship of these two pieces here. This is tucked in there, that's seated over its post correctly. This cover, now as you'll see, these arms are floating about on there doing nothing exciting. It should be seated much like that. Get it over the pins. That looks okay. The two screws. The plain one at this end. The return spring goes on here. Let's cock this action. Let that arm swing down out of the way. The return spring. Let's rotate this. My tweezers are magnetic, sorry. Return spring sits there like that, and then we're going to hook this spring in behind here once it's in place. So the screw that holds this in position has got a little shoulder on it that the spring must be free to rotate around. And if you get that spring stuck underneath the shoulder of the screw, it won't be free to move. Like that, it's stuck under there now. I think it just fell into position. That spring is free to move. Check that I've got both screws tightened up. Now I need to swing that spring in position. Now there's a notch in the back of this arm. Just release this mechanism. There's a notch in the back of this arm right here that spring hooks into. That's all sprung loaded. Everything appears to be working fine. I'll put the flash sync setting lever, self-timer setting lever in place on the shutter now. The detent spring resides in the inside of the case. See if I can get you so you can see it. It's hiding under this piece. Right down here is a little detent on the inside of the case. I just gave that a wipe of molybdenum paste. Here's our settings lever. Normally I give this a wipe on those teeth. Once through the centre. That's it pretty much. And we'll fit this in place on the shutter. So getting it in position. Where's the tail of our spring? Over here. Alright. Looking in this gap here, if you can get something behind it you can see. Looking in this gap here you can see a spring. That's the end of this spring here against the case. our pin needs to come up inside this gap here. This tab needs to come into the slot in the case over here. We've got to wriggle this thing around that flash contact. So normally I start with getting that tab in the slot, swinging this over the flash contact there. Let's get this, I've managed to get this jammed. The pin needs to be able to come out through that slot, but more importantly, this pin here needs to come up against that spring. And I've just got it on the right side now. So that's seated there correctly. Give it a little jiggle. You can see that it moves smoothly there, freely. This piece, this is the cover, the catch. This is the catch that holds your flash sync setting, and it's the one that you hold away to change things. This fits over here. That post comes up through this hole. You need to pull this lever away so that it's not trapped on top of that piece. Then we have 3 black screws that hold this plate in position. I wouldn't be at all surprised if on some shutters you'll find that these screws are nickel plated, not black. It wouldn't surprise me much. Deckel did a few things with screws in this position over time. Some shutters used to have the plate was countersunk, so you had a flathead screw in those positions. Okay, anyway, that's in. That's our flash sync lever in position. Pop this back in the holder so I can see what I'm doing. Alright, so if you hold this button in, you can move this lever. And you can possibly see this spring here moving as I move away. That's that spring acting against that post. What's next? Oh, I think we'll put the main spring and the main cam in the shutter now. They can go in. So the main spring looks absolutely clean. There's nothing on it in the way of lubricant. I'll just clean this, put some naphtha on a cotton bud, and then I'll show you how I lubricate that before I put it in. Okay, here's our main cam. I'll just get some molybdenum paste on the toothpick. What do I normally do? I normally give a quick wipe through the centre. This curved surface here, you want some on that. Make sure there's some on that surface. That's where it contacts the retard gear train. Some on the catch here. Some on the catch there. And see if this will wriggle into place for us. Usually you've got to swing this away. It's not going today. What I'm going to do is remove this screw, take this bracket off out of the way. It's a snug fit when the bracket's in place. Sometimes you can wriggle it in and out, other times it's just awkward. Easier to take that off and be done with it. That's better. That's in place. We're just catching on the tail of that spring there as I was trying to put it in. Of course you couldn't see that before, at least I couldn't. Let's put this bracket back in place. This bracket's important because it holds the other end of the main spring. One end hooks to the main cam, the other end hooks to that bracket. That's the released position round here. Where's our spring? Here's the spring. I'll give that a wipe of molybdenum paste. Frequently you'll see these completely smothered in graphite grease. Alright, so the little tab sticking up on the end of that spring drops into that hole. You see that hole? Yeah, you can just see that hole there. That's where that spring drops into. Like that. This end at the top has to be swung around and it drops into a notch in the bracket here. And if the spring's got lots of tension like this, sometimes it wants to pop away. So I'm just going to make sure I'm holding the spring there so it can't get away. Swing that around, drop it into its notch. So the end of the spring is now trapped in that notch. Let's get some molybdenum paste, and on the arm of this leg of it, I'll run some molybdenum paste there. If I swing this across to lock it in the cocked position, this will rotate. It should latch in position. That's on the B setting that releases. Alright, that's looking okay. Let's put our shutter release lever in place, which is this piece. I'll give it a quick clean. The reason I'm cleaning these parts is to remove any old grease, because any old grease will have picked up dust and grit which acts as a grinding paste. That's going to fit down in here. Let's give that a little wipe and get this in place. The tail of the spring here has to hook right round here and it tucks underneath the plate at this point. That's it. So there's our release lever. You can see how it lifts the B lever up, keeps it out of contact with the mechanism. Let's try cocking that again. It's cocked. That's not coming in. Why is that not coming in? This arm's not dropping down far enough to catch that tab. What is wrong? This is not dropping into position. I've not got this top plate assembled correctly. The little tab underneath there should be sticking out and it's not. That tells me I've done something wrong. Okay. Alright, remove this top plate. Hook that spring so it's not under tension. Okay, so the position of this arm was incorrect. It was tucked in underneath and it should have been sticking out. See if I can get this round the right way now. Should look something like that. That's better. Now the mechanism should latch and hold the main cam in the cocked position. Yeah, that spring's free to rotate. That's as it should be. I'll hook that spring into position on that arm. That's dropping down to the correct point now. So now when I cock this and rotate this, the main cam should latch into position, which it does. And then if I release the shutter, it should fire. Oh, it's released here. There you go. The shutter release here just releases the internal cocking ring, which then releases the shutter by acting on this arm. The same basic mechanism has been used in different ways on the various synchro compor shutters. Alright, that part looks correct, finally, and at long last. The retard gear train and the self timer can be done next. I've got those here. And what I typically do with these is stick them in a little jar of naphtha. Just put that little jar of naphtha into the ultrasonic cleaner so it's surrounded by water, and I just give it 10 minutes or so, and that'll blast away any rubbish that's in these things, and then pull them out, blow away any naphtha and any suspended oils or solids, and lubricate these with graphite powder. So when you see these come back, they'll be ready to put back in the shutter. Let's put the retard gear train in first. I'm going to cock that, cock this, which brings this tab out of contact with the retard gear train. Retard gear train drops in here. At this end, this tab must be pulled back so that it drops behind this tab here on the blade actuating ring. If you just don't do that and just tighten that up, you will damage stuff. You have a speed train that doesn't run down correctly, if at all. Just check that's free. It is. Get the other screw in. Now there's some adjustment here because the hole in the retard gear train is larger than the diameter of the screw. There's some adjustment. Now in this case we know we've got a very robust spring in there, so starting this somewhere close to the centre is probably good. We'll release the shutter and see what we get. That sounded alright to me. We'll see how we go when we put the speed settings, cam plate and everything on the finished shutter and see if we're getting something close. That sounded a bit short for 1 second. Now our retard, the self timer or delay action can go in. This has to fit over the post coming out here. That looks something like right. It appears to be seated, so let that run down a bit. It's held in place with a single screw. Alright, let's try that shutter. Cock the shutter. Pull on this tab, set the self timer, release the arm here. The self timer would run down because the internal cocking ring would be pulling this tab back. As that runs down, it releases the shutter and the shutter opens and closes for the exposure. That looks pretty good. The only thing I'm concerned is that that 1 second speed might not be slow enough. Might be too fast. But we can close this up and see how we get on. So what I'll need will be the internal cocking ring, the pinion, the cocking pinion, the latch that holds the shutter in the cocked position, the shutter speed settings cam plate, and the shutter speed settings cam plate retainer. If I clean those components up, I can put those into the shutter. So I just need to wipe all of those pieces down carefully with naphtha and a cotton bud. I'll show you what's done in terms of lubrication. Start putting these pieces back on. I've got the final parts here cleaned. So I'll put some molybdenum paste on the shaft here. Now you need to make sure that the little tab on this pinion drops into that slot there. Between the end of the spring and that bracket, because the pinion actually moves that piece here. That's when it revolves. Right, the internal cocking ring. I usually just run some molybdenum paste around the inside edge. You could be using graphite grease, whatever you've got. I usually run some around the outside edge there, And that's about it. Now this thing, the spring on the tail of it has to hook over that post. I'll rotate this clockwise as I drop it into position. Now the position of our pinion relative to this is such that the last tooth on the rack, the last tooth on the cocking ring, sits between the first two teeth on that pinion. And then everything will work. If you get it one tooth out, things won't work and you won't like the result. Alright. This latch mechanism fits over this post here. Making sure everything's staying seated. You can see this lever's just sitting on top there when it should be butted up against it. Likewise over here. And this tab needs to be out. So my internal cocking rack was sitting on top of things when it should have been sitting in behind them. The internal cocking rack pulls against the tab here on the delay timer. That's as this ring comes round, it activates that part. That's what happens when you set the self-timer, and that's what tells the self-timer to run down once you've released the shutter. The speed settings cam plate, much the same. I just run a wipe around the inside edge so that it'll move smoothly around there and around the cam surfaces here. You don't need much. Now, on the top here, I just run a little bit of wipe of lubricant there. This just fits on. You've got to make sure that the B lever here is not trapped underneath this. You can see the pins here for the retard gear train. They're not trapped underneath it. Everything's looking good, and I can fit the retaining ring in place, which just clips in. And that shutter's complete there. So we should be able to see this thing run down normally. So I'm going to cock it. I've got a special tool here for cocking this, but if you're gentle you can use tweezers or something to cock that. Let's pop this back in its stand. Is it going to go for us? There it is. If I set it to, that's a 15th of a second, I happen to know that this bump is an 1/8 of a second. We'll set the self-timer. We'll release the shutter, the self-timer should run down, it should run down nice and smooth, and we should get an 1/8 of a second for our shutter. Self-timer is now running down. And there's your 1/8 of a second. And that sounded good to me. I'll check that on my shutter testing machine, and assuming that that's right, we can look to fitting this back to the front plate. Well, we've got some ideas to do about that front plate, so we'll think about that. I was cleaning up these parts. This is the front mount, the lens mount, and I noticed that there's a little dent up here in the rim. You can probably just about see that there if I get that down in focus. Yeah, right there. There's a dent in the rim. It feels rough. So I got the shutter speed setting ring and I popped that in there to see if it would move smoothly, and it doesn't. It's tight. This edge has certainly been pushed in. Now I expect that that happened at the same time that the lens got its dent in it too. I'm going to have to see if I can press out that edge slightly so that it's not causing us problems. And I'll do that just with the tail of my tweezers, just trying to roll that out. This is probably chrome brass. There's not much thickness there, so it'll probably move easily. And I need to make sure that the shutter speed setting ring moves freely, because it certainly does not. But I know where it is, I can see exactly where the problem lies, so I've got to work on this spot and see if I can push that edge back out. It's quite a sharp mark there. It looks like it's actually cracked metal. So yeah, it could be entertaining getting it out without damage. I could actually notch that little piece of the rim out, you'd never know. But I want to see if I can straighten it up somewhat. That's very annoying. Let me work on that. It'll be brutal. I'm not going to do it on camera. Well, I had success. There's still obviously a mark on the top there next to the N, but the shutter speed setting ring now moves absolutely smoothly past there. That won't give us any problems at all. I'm pleased about that.